Hey everyone, I am Nate McGackey, Executive Director of Arts North Carolina, the state's arts advocacy organization. And I want to thank everybody for joining us for this afternoon's webinar, Fundraising in a Time of Crisis, for arts councils, visual arts, and other nonprofit arts organizations. So I want to put out a big thank you to Robert Swaney Consulting, who is making this available for the Arts North Carolina community for free. For those of you that aren't familiar, Robert Swaney Consulting is a national fundraising consulting firm focusing specifically on arts and cultural organizations with a fundamental approach that is effective for any size institution or market. And they also offer a comprehensive array of services which they customize to all of their clients' needs. Joining us on the webinar today and presenting are Bob Swaney, who's the founder and CEO of RSC, which was established back in 2006. Very highly sought after nationally and has over 30 years of experience in fundraising for arts institutions. Also joining us is North Carolina's own and former Arts North Carolina board member, Kat Heights-New, who is an accomplished nonprofit leader with more than 15 years of experience. She's helped raise more than $75 million for the Arts Council of Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, from those of you that may know her from her time there. And she brings a breadth of experience that extends beyond just arts organizations, but also includes colleges and community foundations. And also want to welcome Christine Olson from Arts North Carolina, who's going to be reading some of the questions that you guys put in the chat box today. So without any further ado, I will hand it over to Bob and Kat. And again, thank you all so much for making this great content available to the North Carolina arts community.
Hey, thank you, Nate. This is Bob, and thank you, Christine. Thanks again for Arts North Carolina and being so welcoming as we put this together and helping us get some message out about some of the trends that we're seeing, how we're talking to some of our clients and so forth. And so we're gonna spend the next hour really kind of unpacking some of that for you, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So we're looking forward to this time, and thanks for everyone for attending and taking time out of your day to spend with us so we could have this this presentation and this conversation together. So again, I'll touch real quickly for those of you who don't know, we're an Indiana-based firm that works exclusively with arts and culture groups throughout the country. We've done quite a bit of work there in North Carolina and mostly with arts organizations and with the symphony and with the Arts Council. It's how Kat and I got to know each other, so fantastic. And we've worked really now since 2006, just touching base with over a hundred or more arts organizations, and worked in 80 markets in all sizes, from hundreds of millions of dollar annual operating budgets down to $500,000 and sometimes even below. So we're just really enjoy what we do. We enjoy the journey with our clients, and we're pretty adaptable to it. So as you think about questions today, even if what we're talking about doesn't specifically address what what your organization is, just know that we can be adaptable. We're happy to talk about those things as well. And Kat's been introduced, but I'm happy to have her on as my sidekick, and she's great with our firm. And I just want to have her take a second to introduce herself as well.
Sure. So I'm very happy to see lots of familiar names on the participants list today. So hello to all those folks that know me from back in my Arts Council days. What you may not know is I've been working with RSC for almost 4 years now, the last 2 of which I have been working with them full time. And in that time, I've had a wonderful experience being able to work with arts organizations, a breadth of arts organizations across the country, ranging from budgets of $1 million with just a handful of staff to budgets over $60 million with a core of staff. So that perspective that the firm brings from past work and continuing work, the boots on the ground work we've been doing as arts organizations have been responding to this situation is a core part of the value that we're bringing to presentations like this and the work we do across the country. So glad to be with you all.
Thanks, Kat. We'll jump right in, and there'll be sort of some overview, some best practices information that we'll talk about. Kat will take you through a little bit later some very direct segmentations of types of donors and how we handle those relationships right now. But in essence, today we'll do an overview of our best practices, particularly as it's been overlaid during the recent history here with the virus and with the stock market and the lockdown and all those kinds of things. Like how on earth can we continue to fundraise? And rest assured, if you're not, you should be, because you can. And we will definitely talk about some of those things today. We'll talk about the donor cycle. It'll be a familiar flywheel that we talk about, and we'll apply some of our best practices to that as well, particularly again during this pandemic. We'll also discuss the strengthening of relationships over the next 18 months, particularly in an environment where the frequency and method and manner in which you see your constituents may not be what it has been in the past. So we'll have some ideas for you there as well. Talk about fundraising options for 20 and 21 as you kind of go into your new fiscal years. And then again, we'll do this general Q&A. We'd like to leave you about 20, 25 minutes for that if we can. So listen intently and come up with good questions. We're happy to field those for you. So the first thing we'll talk about, the crisis fundraising best practices. Where the kind of work that we do is, I look at us more as a coaching firm. So rather than doing interim work or things like that, we take board members and staff members, and what we do is we talk about our best practices, and we teach and coach what we can, so that when we're done working with a place, they really own those fundamentals. And so as a fundamentally based organization, we took that and we overlaid it with what we term as a crisis fundraising. We've dealt many times with one-off organizations that were in crisis, but I think it's safe to say that none of us have dealt en masse like this with this many organizations in a crisis, in a country that's in a crisis, in a world that's in a crisis. And so we took what we knew and we've adapted it to the best of our ability. We've asked lots and lots of questions. We've done nearly 100 hours of pro bono phone calls and follow-ups and webinars and one-on-one touching base. And with that, we've come back, and it's the reason we want to share some of this stuff is because we've done our homework and put it against our own best practices. So one of the biggest things we can say right now is to focus on what you can control and what you can influence. One of the things that we noticed in our phone calls, in the time that we spent with just professionals out there, many of them were focused on all the things they could not control, things that changed rapidly, things that they didn't really have any kind of influence on. So what we work to do is say, listen, there's in any situation, there are things that you can actually control and the things you can actually influence. And those are the things that you have to focus on right now, because everything else will be a waste of time. It changes too rapidly and you don't have an effect. So why spend time on it? Some things in terms of like spending time with your patrons on the phone, continuing to put information out. We'll get into some of those details in just a minute. But we really want to say, have a laser focus on the things you can control and influence. We also said keep the money. So in organizations that might have sort of any sort of admission fee, any sort of membership fee, and those were dependent on any sort of openings or events that would have very defined time frames, 60 days, 90 days, whatever. And if you knew you had to cancel it, finding a way to keep the money in the current fiscal year was paramount for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is because no one really knows exactly when things will start to look normal or things will be adjusted to a new normal in that regard. So most patrons have been very generous about it. We'll talk about those options kind of going in here in a few minutes. The third thing we said was continue to create value. Don't be a need-based organization. Don't put out need-based asks. It's too convoluted. That is too busy right now. Everyone says they need the money. And so producing and promoting art and putting that out there, anything you can do to create value. Engaging your artists, your partner organizations, your board members, so as much as you can continue to engage groups that can then engage with your donor base, your sponsors, your foundations, any of your institutional donors, that can actually be organized pretty quickly and at low cost and at low time investment. And we say keep asking and stewarding. Remarkably, the question comes back over and over to us again: should we be asking for money right now? And the cynical part of me says, well, if you're not getting earned revenue and you're not asking for contributed revenue, what do you have left? And but even that practical part aside, the answer is yes, of course you should. Most donors continue to be very generous, even through this difficult period. And we'll kind of go through some of those. Kat will go through specifically what some of those approaches look like and techniques and tactics. So we'll get down into the nitty gritty part of that as well. And then we say prepare for more fundraising in 20 and 21. We're of the belief now that because earned revenue, however you earn that, has its foot off the pedal. The fundraising has to have its foot fully on the pedal, and that will likely increase in importance over the next 12 to 18 months. We believe that philanthropy and that contributed revenue will begin to account for a much larger portion of operating budgets for nonprofit institutions. So enough of the theory. What can you do right now? There are a few big pieces you can do right now. 6 actions that you could take immediately to raise more money. You can create and post content online. Nearly every organization, despite budget size, can do this now because technology has caught up to the point where we can do events like what we're doing right now. We can present online art, we can present online music, we can do virtual galleries, we can do all sorts of things now. And if your organization is so small that it or doesn't have the technicalities of it, or doesn't have the art available, what I've seen very successfully, what I've seen other organizations do is just simply borrow from cousin organizations. So from a larger museum or from a larger art institute or from whatever, and begin to post that out and share those kinds of links. Member organizations like Arts North Carolina can do it, and larger institutions like the League of American Orchestras and AMA and all. So they post that kind of content very regularly as well. You can piggyback on that if you can't produce your own. Regardless of what it is, though, we say constantly promote, keep promoting, keep communicating, keep putting this in front of your donors and your supporters, your consumers on this, because it's just about the only way they're getting it at this point. And it puts you in a position of creating and promoting value. We also say double down on stewardship. And by stewardship, we basically mean stay in communication with people, your donors, your other patrons, care about them, reach out to them. It doesn't always have to be about an ask for support. It doesn't always have to be about their membership. But this idea of saying really reach out to them and make sure that if you are sharing, if you're creating and posting content, they understand how to access that and they're enjoying it, get their feedback. And as we talk more about stewardship today, you'll see pretty much what we mean by that. Asking for support, already talked about that, but this idea of continuing to ask for support, that erring on the side of asking is very important for organizations right now. And for those who aren't, we believe they're actually missing an opportunity for both now and for later. If we begin to lose contact with our patrons, if we're not stewarding them, and if we're not keeping some semblance of normalcy by asking for support. So we say also engage your artists, your partner organizations, and your board. We said that a moment ago. It's really important and it's easy to do. And in most cases, it costs almost nothing. So we look at that, and we also say consider engaging a guide for fundraising. And when we talk about it, of course, it could mean a consulting firm like ours. It doesn't have to mean a consulting firm. Sometimes there are local resources. But the point is while your organization is going through such stress and struggle and change and adaptability and trying to stay nimble, the last thing that you need is to try to create the fundraising apparatus yourself and be responsible for that as well. So to engage someone who can help make that efficient, keep you from making mistakes, can keep help you keep the momentum going. Those are all really important things, particularly now when you just don't have a lot of thinking time, and you have a little preparation time, and you have a little just go out and get it done time. And so that's why we suggest somehow getting someone who can be responsible for making sure that the fundraising is working efficiently and at high capacity. Well, so for every list of things you should do, there's always a list of things you shouldn't do. And so we came up with a list of 6 actions you should not take. And again, this is based on our conversations and our own best practices. But the first one is, don't focus on needs-based fundraising. And because right now, everybody needs the money. I can't say it much more briefly than that. But everyone needs to raise more money, and that includes health and human services. And the more that our approach looks like health and human services, the less money we're going to raise. It's value-based. And we'll talk a lot about value-based messaging as we go through the next few minutes here. Requiring the board to fully fill the gap. It's what nonprofits do. And most board members understand that's part of a responsibility, is to help during tough times, especially. But to lay the entire responsibility on the board is a fatal mistake. And so they should and could be a part of a larger plan, but the plan shouldn't start and stop with them supporting the institution through a tough, difficult period. Third thing not to do is disappear. And I've seen some institutions do this where they literally went dark. The staff doesn't come in, there's no work being done, they aren't communicating. And to me, it's just a prelude to a very, very bad ending for these institutions. So not communicating does a lot of terrible things, not the least of which is for your patrons who really care about you, and for institutional funders who are really invested in you, not hearing from you, it's left to their own devices to wonder what's going on. And it's usually pretty bad the way they fill that in, and not in a way that's going to inspire future giving. So don't disappear on them. Don't openly discuss bankruptcy. And again, some of you might chuckle at that. I've actually seen it happen, and it's ending with dire results. Most of the longtime supporters have completely lost confidence in institutions that do that. While it's a tool and while it's an understandable tool, the idea that you would publicly go out and use that as a way to help raise money, which has been tried, is pretty bleak, and usually people don't give to a bleak cause. So number 5, considering that philanthropy is either all in or all out, and with donors, and so as Kat goes through her portion, she'll talk a lot about flexibility, how we approach donors in a different way. And just because they've behaved one way up till now doesn't mean that's the way they'll continue to behave, and how can we help them be adaptable, and how can we adapt to their situations and their desire to be generous. So number 6, of course, relying too much on government money, the loans for your organization's recovery. While that stuff is great, and I'm really glad it happened, and we know we could talk about a lot of success stories already of how that's kept some organizations moving forward. The fact of the matter is, and I think Kat said this earlier in a conversation we had, was that it's a great first step. And if you got the money or can get the money in an upcoming cycle, great, do it. But it's only the first step, and it's part of the plan. But just like relying on the board, it's not the whole plan. So we just ask, think about where that fits in. It's a great piece, but it's not the only piece. So message and frequency matter. Here's what we learned, and here's what we've been saying as well, that because there's so much message-wise and organizational-wise that's changing at a rapid pace, we're cautious about how much detail to go into at any one time with your patron base and your donor base. So this idea of telling them one thing, and then 3 days later it changes, and then 2 more weeks it changes again, and then a month after that it changes again, it can really cause a lot of confusion. We're concerned about that kind of confusion, and we're concerned about what that does to giving. Generally speaking, when a patron becomes confused, or they're not sure that they're being told the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, they tend to stop giving, or they'll pull back because they're not sure what's going on. So we say stay with the things that are most constant with your organization. It's not that you shouldn't and can't look forward. Of course you should. Of course you should talk about those things. But to get into the weeds on details, and then those details change over and over and over again, can really erode confidence. And so we say stay with the stuff at a higher level, It's okay to talk about vision. It's okay to cast vision. It's okay to talk about when you're going to be open again, when you're going to be producing art again and displaying art and having interactivity and all those sorts of things. But talk about it in general terms until you get real solid details and then start to lay that out. Again, we talk about focus on activities and value. So what are you doing and why is it valuable? Who can it impact? And how do you do it in a unique way? If you can focus on that, that's a real big part of your case statement moving forward. And we say, if you do have bad news, and there is going to be bad news, if you have bad news and you have to deliver that out to your patron and donor bases, it's fine, but try to surround that with at least a couple of positives, because even though there are bad situations, it's not all bad. And if you're being creative and moving forward and re-energizing your institution, looking for opportunities, it's okay to talk about those things as well. Those positives are what inspire people to give you feedback and to stay in touch and to be a part of your institution. So sort of in the next vein, we say, become peddlers of hope. And we're familiar with the old saying, hope's not a strategy. And I actually have said that a million times, and I believe it too. But I do think that right now, here today, especially now, that hope can be a tactic, and it should be a tactic. And we can put that out there for people. The vision that our institutions are going in, why we're essential, what people miss because we're not around right now, what we're doing to promote and produce art and put it out there. I mean, those are all really good things that we can continue to talk about. And I say over communicate and make it interactive when you can. This goes back to don't disappear, but really we think that we're over communicating if we send something once every 2 or 3 weeks. And I know organizations now that are sending things out every 2 or 3 hours, and which is probably overkill. But some who are sending things out almost daily, and when it's important and timely and interesting, it's actually okay. And I've talked to them, their click rates are remaining the same, their dropout rates are not increasing, which I know those kinds of things are always a concern. But really right now, because it's the only way to get information, we actually think people are a little more accepting of it, and so the opt-out rates aren't what they sometimes are, and the open rates are higher than usual. So we'd encourage you to just keep communicating on that level, and then also on a one-on-one level with your donors and higher level donors, some of your sponsors and other constituents, that you just make sure that they feel connected to you. Next slide is the donor cycle that we talked about. This should look pretty common to anyone who's in fundraising. This is just how we've adopted it. We look at these areas of identification for a donor, cultivating that person, soliciting them, appreciating or stewarding them, and then somewhere down the line talking about, is it time to increase them or have them look at something very specific in fundraising or come to an event or whatever that looks like. So this is a pretty common kind of cycle. We understand that particularly now, not every cultivation is going to lead to an immediate solicitation, and not every solicitation is going to immediately get you a gift that you can then steward. So right now we're focused and we're putting cultivation and appreciation together in our discussion, because the characteristics are really, pretty similar. How you bring someone into your organization and then how you appreciate them after they've made a gift have a lot of similarities. The solicitation part of it, even though it's usually the smallest part of this cycle, of course, it's a very important part of the cycle, and it's what leads from cultivation. And then once someone makes a gift, we want to continue, of course, to steward that gift. Right now, particularly in this environment, it's not enough to get a donor, but we really have to work extra hard to keep a donor, much harder than we have ever had to before. And I think that kind of trend will continue as well. So critical to the cycle, yes, consistently give attention to each of those steps that we just saw. Make sure that it's outwardly focused on the donors and the value, and that they're fully engaged. Make sure you have a communications plan so that you know when you're going to release things and what type of things you're going to communicate and who's going to do it and how it's going to be done and what kind of feedback you're going to ask for. Really focus on mutually beneficial relationships. This is a time when we're tempted to go to our donors as if they were an ATM machine, and they're not. Of course they're not. So whatever we do with them has to be mutually beneficial. And we have to make sure they have needs right now too. They're locked up too. They can't consume art the way they normally do. There's all sorts of business and family relationships that they're concerned. I mean, they have real concerns. And so we say, make sure that in the conversations we're being genuine, and that we are being concerned about more than just, is it time for this person to give, and how much are they going to give, and how do we ask them? So we emphasize the cultivation and stewardship opportunities quite a bit. And then the last point is we do customize gift requests. Behavior is going to change, at least temporarily for many people, and we have to be adaptive to that. So customizing our gift requests, instead of just expecting that $10,000 donor who gives in May to give $10,000 in May, yet again, but perhaps what we should do is really think about, and through the stewardship connection and so forth, what can we really do to customize the gift request? How flexible can we be, and so forth? So with that, I will turn it over to Kat to talk about these different divisions of cultivation and stewardship, and then the solicitation process and the emphasis that we're giving.
Great. Well, and before we jump into the tactical portion of our time together today, I just want to reinforce something that Bob mentioned earlier in the presentation. And that is this sense of hesitation that we're hearing from around the country, a lingering hesitation around proceeding with fundraising. And we know that that is a real consideration for groups. And we believe, results validate sentiment. And so you heard Bob mention that we are still seeing donors being generous at this time, but want to share with you that precisely from the tactics that we'll walk through today, we have clients and groups that we work with that are having $10,000, $40,000, $100,000 days from implementing these. So the proof out there is that donors are still being generous when we proactively reach out to them. And so that's what we'll walk through today. And as we do, you'll see another key pillar of RSC's approach to fundraising, and that is that we segment our fundraising program by key prospects. Today, we'll walk through our board, premier individual donors. You may also refer to them as major donors within your organization. Broad-based individuals. So typically those are our individual donors that give below $1,000. And then of course our institutional donors, our corporate donors, our foundation donors, and we'll drill down a little bit further as well on grantors, those institutional donors that are most likely to be giving to your organization or have a history of giving to your organization in a directed or a targeted manner. And how do we approach that in this environment? So you'll see that as we walk through those key prospect segments, we've really divided the tactics into two areas: the cultivation and the stewardship, and then the solicitation. So how do we build relationships and position these donors for an ask? And then how do we actually approach the ask itself? What is key to that solicitation at this time? And so starting off with the board, it is no surprise that we start this presentation by focusing on the board because it dovetails with what we believe about them. They really are the pace setter for our fundraising success. And we know that this is true because personal involvement equals investment. So it's no surprise that our board members are actually among our top donors. And so when we think about cultivation and stewardship of these individuals right now, communication is key. So that's communication to the group as a whole, but it's also one-on-one based on their role within your organization and your board and their skills. So don't always just think of the board as a group or one entity. They actually are individuals who have different propensities, different skills, different assets that they bring to the table, and approach them as such. So this is important both for their investment in your organization as volunteers and as donors, but also because they're the voice of your organization. They're really your ambassadors as they talk with their networks, and they're the ones helping you communicate confidence and hope through this time for your organization. I do want to mention, especially with the board, when we talk about cultivation and stewardship, is that these are volunteers, and with all volunteers, recognizing what they do and thanking them often and publicly is actually the most important factor in getting them to take that good action again. So whether that's from a volunteer standpoint, something they may do as a service of their time, or whether that's actually making a gift, we want them to take that action again. So it's important that we thank them the way that we would thank any of our other major individuals. So let's talk about solicitation of the board. We really believe, as I said, this is a group entity for your organization. And so you can set context to the group, but make sure that the asks are personal. These are one by one with a specific ask amount determined for each and every board member. And so when we talk about setting context for what that individual gift means, what we mean is that these board members, our mantra with them is that they are the pace setters for our fundraising program. They should be giving first and giving strong to drive momentum for our fundraising. Essentially, they're the core of our overall success in meeting the goal. And so sometimes that's a little more abstract. And so we try to give a little more specificity to what we mean by them driving momentum for the fundraising program. And so we can do that easily. Our favorite way to do that is through a collective challenge grant. What we typically see this coming to reality as is that new or increased gifts from board members would be pulled into a larger matching grant that could be turned out to solicit support from the next wave of donors. So it's a really tangible way for you to communicate how their early and strong giving can drive momentum and help provide leverage as you continue through the other segments that we'll talk through today. I do also want to mention, as we think about board giving, that many of you are likely on the cusp of a fiscal year turnover. So we are, we believe very much in multi-year requests. This time is no different. So seeking their support now for the core needs of the institution and the core value of the institution, but also talking with them about their early commitments for the next fiscal year. We've talked with many clients who are essentially front-loading or questioning whether they are just front-loading, kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul from next fiscal year from some major gifts and board gifts that they're receiving now. And what you can do to provide clarity around that is have that as a comprehensive conversation where you're talking both about their support for the immediate infrastructure of the organization, as well as how the organization moves into the 2021 fiscal year. Okay. So let's talk about our premier individuals. As I've mentioned, and I will often refer to these folks as our major donors, just as with our board, we want to make sure that we are following the mantra of personal engagement equals investment. And so among our major donors, that happens most in depth through the exchange of information. So that idea of communicating to them updates on your organization, inform them, make sure that they are aware as you make key decisions moving forward. That idea that you want them to be among the first to know. The idea that you wanted to personally reach out to them, see how they're doing, see if they have any questions, see if they had any feedback on the organization's response. And as you do share those updates, we really want to make sure that it's an exchange, it's a dialogue. Your goal should be to have a conversation with your major donors. There's a give and a take here. It's not you just talking for 30 minutes at them about the organization and what it's facing and what it wants to do and accomplish, but really engaging them through a series of questions so that you can seek their feedback and seek their sentiment towards the organization and your plan. So I'll share a few of my favorite engaging questions. I'll tell you, I go back to these kinds of questions almost on a daily basis in the work that I do. But there are questions like, what do you think of our response? Nice open-ended question that gives them an opportunity just to really share their thoughts. You're likely updating them on priorities of the organization as you move forward. So asking them, as they think about those priorities, which are most important to them. And then certainly, as we've talked about this influx of digital content, we want to ask them about their engagement with it. Have they participated in the digital content? What did they find most engaging? And then also that idea that we are looking to the future. So as we look to next year, what are you anticipating most? It kind of gives you an idea of where their priorities lie as the world and our organizations come out of this situation. And then I also do want to take a moment just to talk about benefits. I know that this is something that's on the mind of a lot of arts organizations, and it is because a lot of our benefits actually focus on an in-person interaction. And so what we're advising you to do is take a look at the benefits. And what we find most often, if we just drill down again and again, asking ourselves, so what about these benefits? What works about this? It really boils down to access. So it's sneak peeks, it's exclusive interactions with your artist, it's receiving information about the organization or what's coming up before anyone else. And so just think about how even in an environment where you might not be able to deliver on benefits in person, how you might think about translating some of those same concepts, either virtually or through small in-person, small group interactions. Okay. So let's talk about actually soliciting our major donors. So just as with the board, this work is done one by one. Think about developing that personalized asking plan for your top donors. Your idea that you want to communicate to them is that they are one of a handful of people that can really make your plans a reality now and with an early commitment in the upcoming fiscal year. So thinking about each one of these donors and how that handful of donors can help you move forward and based on your history and knowledge with each and every one of your donors. It's not a blanket call to action to your top donors, but a bespoke conversation with each one of them. And we'll touch again, as we talk about this, we actually find that as these solicitations with our major donors roll out, that it is the place where the uncertain economic conditions are most likely to arise in the feedback that we get. So you may hear from a major donor, I'm not making any gifts right now. I'm not in a position to make a gift right now. So one of the things, and Bob alluded to this earlier, is that flexibility really is key in giving donors confidence. So as he mentioned, it's not an all or nothing gift. What we're actually finding that when donors express a hesitation around giving, especially our major donors, that one of the things that eases that concern is us giving them the flexibility to choose to pledge now and maybe pay later this summer or installments over the next months. So we love questions. You could tell we focus on questions as we move through this work. So offering up that option to them, putting in the context of many of our other donors have expressed the same concern and chosen to pledge now and pay later. Would that make you more comfortable? So a permission-based ask, if you will. Okay. So let's talk about our broad-based donors. These typically are donors that are under 1,000, though most organizations will have their own threshold of where they start to have a more personal interaction with their donors. Your major donors are typically the ones that any staff member or most of your staff on board could identify them in an event. They know them by name. Your broad base is a crucial element, though, of your fundraising program, now and always. Not only do they provide the breadth of support, a core portion of dollars in the door, but really they're the base of support, base of donors rather, that you can build relationships over time, bringing them along, bringing them closer to the organization and even up to the major donor level. I always, when I mention broad base, want to note there's a fairly infamous study that was done about $1 million plus donors to universities. This was done a few years ago. And universally, all of those donors who had given over $1 million to a university started off their donor relationship with that organization at $100 or less to the annual fund. So it's important to remember that these are people who are raising their hand as more interested in our organization, and then therefore identifying themselves for us so that we can focus on building those relationships up and over time. Okay. So along with our board and our major donors, communication is key with the broad base. But with them, the communication happens in a more general way, a more open and economical way. So we're seeing this communication obviously through email, social media, your website. And I'll note that, we've had an incredible response from the arts community, really kind of transitioning the deployment of art to digital platforms. And what we're finding just as that digital art is proliferating is that those organizations that are continuing to engage their patron base are the ones that are really finding ways to engage their audience in participating with the content. So that's through surveys, it's through interactive seminars. And what's most important here is that you're proving to your patrons and to your donors that you're listening. So simply share the results, but also talk about how the organization is using what is this call to action from your base of supporters to plan and to provide art. I also want to note here within the broad base, but also equally applicable within our board and our major donors, is that this is a great opportunity to involve board and artists in the process of thinking. So, it's a solid stewardship moment. We can ask our board and our artists to make phone calls, write notes, have that personal appreciation moment with our individual donors. And that's important just from the standpoint of what we've talked about, of patron preservation, making sure that we stay at the forefront of our patrons' minds. But it's also really important as you think about training up a larger team to be involved in the act of fundraising with you. So what we find often is, and I always joke that I've never worked with an organization who felt like their board and their artist core were as highly engaged in fundraising as they could be. No organization feels that those great assets are fully leveraged. And what we love about stewardship, the simple act of thanking, which makes a lot of our board members and a lot of our artists more comfortable than making a solicitation. It's a great first step in involving them in fundraising. In other words, it's an opportunity for them to dip their toe in the fundraising waters and feel really good about it. So it's not only something that can be helpful to engage them at this point with across the board of all of your individuals, but it's something that can build capacity for your organization in the long term. So let's talk about broad-based solicitations. As Bob has mentioned, there we go. As Bob has mentioned, we want to make sure that our message is value-based. We want to talk broadly to our base of patrons about what your organization means to them and what it means to the community. And what we really want to emphasize here is that focus in on that value rather than quid pro quo donor benefits. As we talked about benefits earlier, your tried and true benefits, or the current core of benefits that you may have, which we often use most within the broad base to communicate those requests and increasing level of participation within the annual fund, they're not going to be as easily fulfilled in this time, especially those that are deployed in person. And so instead, focusing in on what the organization means to them and to the community. And I'll take a moment here just to drill down on that value-based message, or the value proposition, a little further. What we're finding as we're talking with arts groups across the country is, as they identify their unique value at this time, it universally falls in one of three categories, or one of three camps. The first is how you are continuing to provide and deploy the arts at this time. So whether you are providing art via digital or via digital platforms, whether you are working with schools to provide resources to teachers as students are learning from home. So those innovative ways that many of your organizations have already adapted to, or are planning and are in the works to adapt to, be able to still provide art and fulfill your mission at this time. The second category is how you are still supporting artists and your core of teaching artists. If you're an arts education organization, how you are still supporting those arts educators, which not only is that important from a standpoint of the sentiment just across the country of continued employment and support in this time of strife, but it's also important as you think about these artists as your core creative asset. They are essentially the place from which your mission emerges. So being able to communicate to them how you are still supporting them, and then therefore supporting the creation of art at this time. And then the third category, when we think about our value propositions, universally is how you are going to return, whether that's return to the stage, whether that's return to the concert hall, whether that's return to the classroom, whether that's return to the gallery, the community as a whole. You may be a community, an arts outreach organization. And so how you are going to deploy the arts and how you are going to triumphantly return to what you do best. And so that idea of hope and planning and the scenarios and the confidence that you as an organization will emerge from this and will continue to provide value throughout. So I just wanted to take that moment, just walk through those. I'll do a quick recap on them. It's how you're still deploying art. It's how you're still supporting artists, and it's how you're going to triumphantly return to the community when we're back to a place of normalcy or new normalcy. So just think about that. One of the questions we continuously receive, and I think is especially applicable as we talk to the broad base, is how in the world do we compete as arts organizations with health and human service organizations that are providing basic needs in our community? And our answer to that is don't. If you try to get in the basic needs game, you're going to lose. Bob mentioned earlier in the presentation, all people, all organizations, all businesses are in some sort of need at this time. And so it's why we want to hone in, especially with the broad base, on those three value propositions or categories of our value proposition. It's where we're going to win, and it's where we are uniquely positioned to provide value. Okay. A couple of other things I'll mention on just broad-based solicitations. We talk a great deal within the firm about creating a sense of urgency. And what we mean by that is simply, how do we motivate donors to take an action now, rather than think about the action and maybe I'll make a gift later. So why give today? I mentioned earlier challenge grants. They are a wonderful opportunity. Challenge grants work well on both sides of the coin. They motivate major donors to give heroic gifts to establish challenge grants, but they work very effectively at your broad base to help you motivate donors to make a gift by a set deadline. Your gift will be doubled today. All gifts through May 15th will be doubled, that idea. So you're able to set a little more context to the immediate value and impact of their giving. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how we actually deploy the channels of our appeals on the broad base. So this is particular to our broad base. And what we're advising is that you put into place some very simple, systemized, and evergreen appeals. These are simple things like a Give Now button on your website, a Give Now button on every single e-blast, not just e-blasts that are intended to be solicitations, but when you're sending out any information about your organization, there should be a nice, clean Give Now button on that communication. We have groups that have been winning at the donor acquisition game just because of the increased volume of digital communication right now, and simply having a donate now or a give now button on those communications. So we had predicted that during this time, donor acquisition or bringing in new donors would not be as lucrative as we typically see in this time of year. But where we are seeing that new donor influx is through just the heightened interaction that we're having with donors online, through social media, etc. So some simple evergreen things you can put into place. Set it and forget it. But we also want to talk a little bit about phone. So phone is a powerful resource for you. If we think about an arc of effectiveness of communication with our donors, on one end of the spectrum, we think about the most highly effective as being in-person solicitations, actually, sitting down over that cup of coffee with a donor and talking about their giving. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have what we typically consider passive approaches, things like letters, emails, etc., things that typically are deployed in a more efficient way to our broad base. And right in the middle typically is phone. But what's interesting is that phone, obviously out of necessity in this environment, is inching much closer to in-person in effectiveness. And that's just both because of the realities of our situation, but it's also because people are more accessible right now. I have never seen the volume of call pickups that clients are reporting at this time. People aren't screening calls in the same way they are. They're, especially if they're seeing they're coming from someone they know within an organization or an organization that they know. And people are hungry for interaction. So the success rate of phone calls has exponentially increased in this environment. And what I'll tell you is, I know many groups do not have a professional telefunding program. We're not necessarily, that's not what we're advocating for you to implement, but really thinking back to that idea of how do we activate our board volunteers and our artists. This is a great way to give them some simple tools in a focused period of time to help with renewing or upgrading your broad-based donors. Okay. So let's talk about institutional giving, our corporate giving, our foundations, government also we put within institutional giving. So as we think about cultivating and stewarding our institutional donors, this is universally the moment that most clients give me a little eyebrow raise. It is not as intuitive that we steward and build relationships on an ongoing basis with our institutional donors. We somehow innately understand that on the individual side, but it's typically the side where we don't fully cultivate and steward on an ongoing basis. And so what we are advocating that you do with your institutional donors is continue the outreach. We're actually recommending that at least once every 6 weeks, you are contacting them in some way to update them on your organization's response and plans. So that contact can be via email, it can be via call, but just making sure that we, as Bob mentioned, we don't want to disappear. We don't want to disappear from our institutional donors. We want to stay at the forefront of their minds because presence equals value. So another piece to think about as you're thinking about your institutional donors is just creating that inventory of what you do expect your activities to be over the next 12 to 18 months. So these might be online offerings, patron offerings, education and community offerings. What we know right now is that we are going to be creative in our approach to fiscal year 2021. You know, what we don't know is exactly what it will look like. But what we do know is that it will be like nothing that has ever been before. And so as you think about those creative solutions to what your next fiscal year will look like, also make sure that you're using that innovation, that forced innovation as surface area to think about sponsorships, to think about funding priorities or dedicated funding to your organization. One thing to remember too is everyone is in recovery mode, including your institutional donors. So this is the greatest time to be a true partner with your institutional donors. Help your sponsors and your funders solve problems, offer them more options, be prepared to think creatively with them. Often we're finding that review cycles are changing or their criteria or their budgets are changing. So be prepared to work within the new boundaries they have. This is another great opportunity to activate your board and your artists. Your board certainly can work as ambassadors about the value and the impact of the organization, but your artists can also be a place where you can provide value to institutional donors. So this might be a great opportunity to involve your artist in somehow interacting with a company's employees or a company's client base. And most importantly, still thank your sponsors. Even if you have to cancel something that they are supporting, make sure that you continue to thank them for the ongoing support. They were intending to support you, even if they haven't converted their sponsorship to an ongoing or an evergreen kind of sponsorship. We want to always be thankful. All right, and let's talk a little bit about soliciting with our institutional donors. So one thing I want you to take away, if it's the only one thing about institutional giving in this environment, is that it's paramount that you come to an agreement with the sponsor or the funder before you write a proposal. I talked with you a little bit in the previous slide about a dialogue based on flexibility. You should have that conversation, offering them options, finding those solutions that best work for them, and come to that place of agreement before you ever put pen to paper on a proposal. So this is a moment where the cultivation, that act of building the relationship and finding the mutually beneficial solution for both the funder and your organization is most essential. As I mentioned, make sure that you're utilizing the new inventory. This is everything from, the digital content that we've talked about, but we're also recognizing that in this environment and as people are coming out of stay-at-home orders, et cetera, that our organizations are going to have to think about something that we've never thought about before, likely, and that is how we create a sterile and healthy environment for our patrons. So we will be thinking more than we ever have about how we are cleaning our facilities and how we're communicating that cleanliness and therefore that safety of our facilities to our patrons. And certainly that is going to have an increased cost. And so we're even thinking about that, as you look to your planning for 2021, think about those hidden or those additional costs, and know that that's actually a really great opportunity. Think about a medical center that might be very excited to partner with an arts organization to talk about the healing and the uplifting power of the arts, and that they are being a partner with you and making sure that the people of your community can return to the arts to enjoy them in a healthy and a sterile environment. So there will be some interesting, that's just one example, but there will be some interesting ways that we use what will be our solutions to the 2021 season or fiscal year in order to creatively fundraise. And then the final piece that I'll mention on institutional giving, let's toggle back to the previous slide for one moment. So the final piece that I'll mention here is that instead of focusing on what you can't offer, focus on what you can. We like to put this in a way of offering donors the option of 2 yeses. So this might look like, we can't recognize you in our program book, but what we can do is give you online recognition for X or Y program. Which one would best fit your giving or your mission? So that idea that you're not honing in on what they cannot receive as a renewing donor or a renewing sponsor, but instead how you're giving them 2 things that they can say yes to as new ways to move forward in that partnership with the organization. All right, and then finally on our tactical portion, I wanted to just hone in on grantors for a moment. This, as with all of our prospect segments, you really need to consider them on a case-by-case basis and be confident and have the conversation. Our relationship with institutional donors, as we've talked about, it's still relationship-based. And most are willing to work with you. We're actually seeing a trend of relaxing restrictions. So maybe you had a grant that was always restricted to education or a core part of your programming in the past. We've actually seen that many corporate and private foundations are relaxing those kinds of restrictions or targeted giving. So be proactive, have the conversation with them, be assumptive that they'll lift the restriction. They are in a position that in order to fulfill their mission, they are still under the obligation to grant the money. So have that open conversation with them about how they can best partner with you. All right. And I'm going to toggle back over to Bob to continue on as we think about planning, especially going into 2021.
Great. Thanks, Kat. Before we go straight into the planning, oh, and there it is. Before we go into that, I just want to top one idea off since we're coming out of the tactical. And I know right now, particularly right now, your organizations are struggling. You're thinking about, what your priorities are. How do you keep things going? How do you get to the next major benchmark for the institution? And everyone's in a similar position at this point. What I don't want you to forget right now, because those kinds of excuses and real situations can keep you from reaching out to donors and keep you from having important conversations, be it stewardship or cultivation or asking, whatever that looks like. You've got enough other things going on right now. And also because of the problems that the institution's having, and that talking to donors, they're not exactly seeing you at your best, at your organization's best. And so oftentimes there can be a reluctance to reach out and talk with them and to engage them. Here's what I'll say about it, and internalize this as much as you want to. There's no shame in being in the positions that we're in right now. And the only shame is not doing anything about it. So creative places think creatively. They figure things out. They move forward. And so the worst thing you could do right now is to not bring your closest constituents in on that and let them know what you're working on, struggling with, and moving toward. They'll always like what you do, and which is important, but they'll love who you are. If you don't remember anything else today, that's what I would want you to remember from this webinar, is that they like what you do, but they love who you are. And so being able to reach out to them and share what's going on, get their input, having them be a part of things, genuinely be a part of things, is extremely important right now. So don't let the situation or your busyness or your other priorities stop you from doing the relationship-based things that are important to the donors as they are to you. So I'll move on now, but I wanted to just give you that one extra thought. What we're saying over the next 18 months, because the starting point's kind of unknown. When do we start back up, or when do we look at resuming something that looks like normal, or a new normal, or whatever that looks like? That's kind of a moving target. And rather than start with a clean sheet of paper every time you decide it's September, now it's November, now it's February, okay, maybe now it's October, that this idea of creating 3 organizational plans and operational plans for your institution, really, the idea would be to create those that they would be similar, but they would be standalone based on 3 major hash marks on the calendar. We're going to use a hash mark that starts startup in close to the holidays, then into the winter, and then into the next fiscal year. Your situation may or may not look just like that, so we're using this for illustrative purposes only. But as we describe it, I want you to think about how this fits in with your situations and options. But along with the operational organizational plan, for each one of those, we say create a marketing plan, because you have to voice what you're doing and get it out there, obviously. The third thing, of course, is you have to have a fundraising plan, because for the immediate future, and probably for the long-term future, fundraising is going to take up a much bigger part of the income pie than it ever has before. So we're going to focus obviously on that. We're not arts marketers. We pretend sometimes for a few minutes, but then we always come back to fundraising. So we're going to stick with our fundraising plan. So we're going to say prepare the 3 fundraising plans, and what's constant about all of them, what's similar about all of them, is you can focus on generosity, both the donor's generosity and your generosity as an institution, because it's a constant. You can message value, always message value, rarely message need. Know your numbers, your timelines, your activities, and for each of the operational plan, you want to be able to explain each one of those plans and incorporate them into your 3 fundraising plans appropriately. And almost in every instance, rather, you should be focused on high leverage, high return donors first to build momentum. Those again are your board members, your high level donors, your major donors, your lead sponsors and lead institutional givers, and maybe some grants and things along those lines. So we say, regardless of which plan we're talking about, put those things first. So the first fundraising plan, again, for our scenario, it was a holiday 2020 launch. How would we look at some of the fundamentals of the fundraising plan? The first fundamental would be, again, to front load your leadership, sponsorship, and any heroic asking. And I'll define the heroic asking here. So above and beyond your recurring giving, your annual fund, there's a likely opportunity that you'll both want and need a handful of donors doing something exceptional or heroic to help you through this first period. So if you usually launch your activities, say in August or September, but now it's going to be closer to the holiday period, there's going to be a period of time where cash flow doesn't look like it always looks, and beyond just the situation that we're in right now. And so for our purposes, we're saying you probably want to have 5 to 10 major donors who are doing something heroic, something far and above and beyond in terms of cash that help you get to the holiday period, and be able then, as you resume operations that create earned revenue, you can do that from a position of strength. We also say curb your high cost, low yield asking until post-election. With the election, we know it's a national election. There's going to be a lot of noise. Doesn't matter which side you're on. For our discussion here, it's really just about not putting one more thing in the mailbox at a time when it's very highly likely that no one will read it. And so direct mail is a high cost, low yield approach usually. So we're saying put the brakes on that until after the election. It's also a good time as you build momentum into reopening operations to get people's attention to do it immediately thereafter. So we also say, though, increase communications -8 weeks. So although there'll be a lot of election noise and stuff, you have to begin building your case and making people re-aware that your operations are going to resume. You're going to start having art again. You're going to be displaying it, presenting it, whatever that looks like. And so you need about 8 weeks to ramp that up. And then we say produce and share art online, promote it with confidence and value. So as you're putting digital content up, and even as you see the light coming that you're going to go full throttle again with opening your facility and going back to normal operations, our advice is don't take your foot off this pedal either. Your constituents hopefully have gotten very used to the idea that you are presenting and promoting art digitally, and so now you've conditioned them to do that. So don't stop. It might actually become part of the fabric of what you do, and again to engender affection and support and to further establish your mission in the community. So the second fundraising plan is a spring and summer, what we're calling a spring or summer 21 calendar 21 launch. The first bullet doesn't really change. Regardless, you need to front load with leadership gifts, major gifts, sponsorships. You might look at multi-year as you move into spring and summer. And I say that because it's depending upon when your fiscal year is. You might be so close to the end of the current fiscal year that you would want to ask a donor to make a gift for both of your fiscal years so that every year henceforth is not backloaded. We like front-loaded campaigns. We like people making their big gifts up front because it mitigates risk on the back end if somebody ever says no to us. We have time to respond, react, cultivate new relationships, and so forth. So if you get in this position where it is automatically backloaded because of circumstances, asking someone to give for both years, make a commitment for both years, can be really in your favor for the long term. We're also then looking at curbing the high cost, low yield asks until programming resumes. So this might be October, November. Again, you have to kind of watch I'm sorry, this is spring and summer. This might be January or February. So kind of watch what that looks like. You might have a launch date of early spring so that you can build up again to the presenting art and being back to operational capacity. Again, the communication -8 weeks before that launch, that really doesn't change. If it's a really intensive time of the year, you might need a little longer ramp of 10 to 12 weeks, but 8 seems to satisfy in most cases what we've talked about. Producing and sharing, again, don't stop doing that. Keep putting it out there and keep telling people it's out there. It's a real plus for you. The third plan is a fall launch. So this would mean, in essence, you miss an entire year of activity. And so how do you approach that? Well, we're going to continue to fundraise throughout that year, obviously. But as you enter into a new year that looks more like what previous years have looked like, plan and schedule is traditional. Continue to increase your communication, though, because even though you've had a lot of one-on-one conversations, you've posted online content, it's time to begin communicating and preparing your patrons to participate again in a more traditional way. Front loading and leadership and heroic asking, again, all falls in fiscal Q1 and Q2. You may or may not need heroic gifts going into that new season, but my guess would be at this point, if you miss an entire year of offerings, you're going to continue to need some level of heroic giving that'll take you safely into your fiscal 22, I guess. And then be ready for any mid-fiscal year changes. So even though you might be planning that you won't launch until a year from now, a year and a half from now, we're telling people to be prepared in this third plan to be very nimble, because just as rapidly as things declined, things could actually improve very rapidly as well. And so as things rapidly improve, you want to be ready. You want to be on your toes on this and be ready. So that the back part of this particular plan, even though it's structured, has to be pretty adaptive. And so if your plans, organizational plans, change to your favor, don't stick to the plan on this. Rewrite the plan and go. Take full advantage of the upside. So we'll do a wrap up and Q&A now. I think we're pretty much on time. We've got a few minutes here for Q&A, and then we've got one final slide to share when we're done. But let's talk a little bit about questions you've had, as specific as you want, either through this presentation or just things that you brought with you to talk about and that you'd like to have answered.
So I want to remind everybody that you can submit your question through the chat. If you don't see the chat box, the icon for that is in the middle of your lower screen toolbar. You click chat, and then you'll be able to type your questions in. We don't have any that have come in yet. We've had some comments, but not really any questions. We'll see. It takes a minute for people to type in. And I will remind everybody, there were questions about whether this is going to be available. Yes, it will be. Definitely by tomorrow, possibly by later this afternoon. It depends on how quickly the video gets processed and I can get it up. The one from this morning is already available on the website, and the slides for both presentations are available on the website as well. And that's on our COVID-19 training and resources page on our website. And you just go to the COVID-19 page and you should be able to get to that pretty easily. There's a little button for that. Are there any questions, or is everybody got all their?
I've got one additional thought that I'll share while
Sure.
folks are thinking, and that we haven't actually done this yet, but I think we're preparing to do it when the timing feels right. So I'll pass it on now since we're all together. The idea is when we think about our major donors and our board and the stewardship and cultivation part of things, you know, one of the things that we often do as arts institutions and related is that we have our top donors sometimes welcome other donors into their home. We have board members who welcome people into their home. So as this begins to lift, the sequestering in our homes begins to lift, one of the things you might explore, and one of the questions you might ask some of your very best donors, closest relationships, board members, is to ask them when they're thinking about being comfortable of inviting people back into their home. It'll do two things for you. One is if you ever want to ask them, or they ever want to offer to help do any sort of cultivation or stewardship event, at least you have a guideline of what they might be thinking. And second, when you're thinking about reopening your facility, having sort of a guide on when your best donors are thinking about opening their homes and when they feel safe, it's a good indication of that in terms of how you start to think about your plans for reopening and welcoming people back as well. So I'll stop there. Do we have some questions?
Yes,
now?
we do. We have a question. It says, do you have any advice about how to think about forecasting our fundraising goals results? Do they need to be put down perhaps 30 or 20%? Any rule of thumb? Do you actually see people reducing their fundraising goals over the next year?
It's really interesting. The evidence we have, which is not 100% mirror of what's going on now, but if you look back at 07, 08, there was a dip of, I don't know, 12% maybe, if my memory is correct, in individual giving over the course of a single year. But then it bounced back, and it actually and was a breakout after that, moving upwards. So there's a possibility. It's one of the reasons that we continue to say value-based fundraising and really begin to not base it on need, because the higher value that you have, the more that they tend to want to invest, even during difficult times. The other part I look at, I suppose, is the stock market, which has been pretty volatile, but for all intents and purposes, the last few weeks has moved sideways, and that's a depending on which side of the side you're on, can be a position of strength. So as confidence increases there and as some of that recovery occurs, I wouldn't be asking less. I think where I would be flexible to try to retain as much renewal money as I could would be to be flexible in terms and timing and number of payments and that to really be accommodating to a donor. The place where you're likely will take it more difficult is through acquisition, through new donations. New donations so people who aren't as close to you, may like what you do but haven't fallen in love with you yet. That idea, and so that's sometimes more difficult, and it's usually a higher cost associated with it as well. So we're looking at how much can you really focus on keeping the donors that you have, increasing the donors that you have, and really trying to increase your overall fundraising. So I can't think of a case right now, in fact, where we're looking at recommending to one of our clients that they should try to raise less money next year than this year.
That's encouraging. There's another question about challenge funds. What are the best practices for those and how they might be different during a crisis like this?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. So, I'll remind you of the sentiment that challenge funds work on both sides of the equation. They're a motivator to major donors to make that heroic gift. It's a feel-good moment for them that their support can be turned out to your broader base to leverage additional support for the organization, just as it motivates what might be the balance of those donors that you're issuing the challenge to make their gift by a certain date. It's the idea of, if I give now, my gift will be even more impactful. So it works on both sides of the coin. I think the most prevalent question I get about challenge funds is there such thing as too many? And I always refer to our friends on public radio. I don't know if anyone from public radio is joining us today, but I always refer to them when they're in their calling campaigns and their campaigns, that there's a challenge almost every single hour. And the reality is that you should seek challenge funds, those that are going to issue the challenge or issue the funds that are the core for the match. Issue them in a way that you are following what we talked about as far as the prospect segments. So you could think about one challenge fund that would be leveraged with other major individual donors. You could think about one challenge that might be a lesser amount that is issued out to your broad base via email, via letter, etc. I've even seen challenges work on a corporate level. So thinking about, you can solicit them on both sides of the coin to increase that overall support for your organization at the time.
Does anybody else have any more questions? Or have we just about covered everything?
Great. Well, I will go to the final slide then. Again, we really thank everybody for joining us today on this. And what my company does not do, we don't turn these presentations into a big sales pitch. But I'm being responsive in this case to a lot of feedback that we received from organizations that want and need help right now, and who don't have a lot of money because they're they're laying off staff, rather they're furloughing, and so we get all that. We are desperate to help organizations. It's the reason that we've done all the calling. It wasn't just to get smarter and to be helped, but we deeply want to be helpful. So we've put together what we call our virtual fundraising coach. It's all done over the internet, just very similar to this. We'll use Zoom and so forth, but it's a 3-month program that's focused on our best practices. It's 8 hours a month of personalized coaching, of either a combination of scheduled or on-demand meetings as you need them. It's $2,000 a month. So if you complete the payment all up front, it's $4,000. You get the 3rd month free. And because right now we understand nonprofits don't really have any risk capital available. If we don't help you raise at least $4,000 in new money, I'll give you the fee back. And I really mean that. It's that important to us that we try to help at a reasonable fee, that we help quickly. And so if you need or want that kind of outreach, you can email us at the address on the very bottom of this slide. We'll be happy to talk with you about it. We're glad to help. We'd love to help you.
Thank you everyone for coming. Nate, do you want to?
We may have lost Nate.
Oh, we may have lost Nate. Nate was trying to be available for very important strategic calls this afternoon. So I'll just thank everyone for coming. And again, this will be all available on our website by tomorrow. And thank you very much to Kat and Bob, who've made this available to everyone. And we're really grateful that you've taken the time to help our members and our arts community out.
It's our pleasure. Thanks
Yes.
all for taking the time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.